In this video, we're going to be talking about properties of matter. We mentioned that that's one of the things that we study in chemistry. Chemistry is all about studying matter and its properties. So we can classify properties of matter into a few different categories. We're going to have two different types of classifications that we're going to think of. And to think about this, I have a picture here of a gold bar. This is an example of a pure substance. This is an element, so it's composed of atoms. And gold has specific properties that we can observe about it. I want you to pause the video and think about what are some of the properties that you can think of for gold. Hopefully you took the chance to think about that. And what we're going to do is some of those things hopefully that you thought of, we're going to classify them into a few different categories. So first are properties that we call intensive properties. Intensive properties are things that don't depend on how much of a substance you have. So they don't depend on amount. So some properties of gold that do not depend on how much of it you have are things like the fact that it is yellow, right? The gold has this very specific color. That doesn't depend on how much gold you have. If you have a little bit, if you have a big chunk, it's going to be the same color. Its melting point, for example, right? You have to get gold quite hot to get it to melt, and there's a specific temperature, and that doesn't depend on how much gold you have. Things like whether it's flammable. Gold is not flammable, well, at least not very easily. And so, right, is it flammable? That would be another example of an intensive property. It doesn't matter how much of it you have. And so these are a few examples of intensive properties. We can also classify other types of properties as extensive properties. These are things that do depend on how much you have. So these are things that depend on the amount. Okay, so this might be something like how big this gold bar is, right? That would be an example of an extensive property. So things like mass, how much of it do we have? That obviously depends on how much of it you weigh out. Things like how much volume it takes up, or how long it is, right? One other example of an intensive property might be its temperature, right? How warm is it? And that won't depend on how much of it you have. So these are two of our examples of, let's get this back, just want to circle with another color, of intensive properties versus extensive properties. So these are our two possibilities here. Okay, now something else we can think about. So that's one sort of like two types of classifications we can have. Another type of classification that we can have are between physical properties and chemical properties. Physical versus chemical. Okay, so a physical property is something that we can observe without any type of chemical reaction, without changing to another substance. Yeah, sometimes my inputs are getting eaten by my computer here, but we're good. Whereas a chemical property is something that we can observe only by a reaction, by some kind of chemical reaction. Okay, so let's go ahead and think about what are some examples of, from the examples we have on the left over here, some of our intensive and extensive properties. So let's look at the fact that our gold is yellow. That does not involve it changing to another substance. So that would be an example of a physical property. Melting point, same thing. Even when the gold melts, it's still gold. It's just liquid gold. Something like a temperature, it doesn't need to change it to another substance, so that would be another example. And then mass, volume, length, these extensive properties. But one example that we have of our or chemical properties here is the fact that gold is not flammable, right? For gold to burn and turn into something else would require it to change, right? When something burns, it's changing into something else. So that'd be an example of a chemical property, that gold is not flammable. So in the next video, we'll do an example looking at water and a few of its properties and decide whether they are physical or chemical.